All right. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to Future Africa Forum. And in this Future Africa Forum, we're going to be discussing democracy and responsibility, the African story. Our guest speaker today is Tiseke Kasambala. She's the Director of Africa Programs at Freedom House. And I'll share a bit about her, but I'm sure she'll share a lot more once I invite her to speak. Tiseke Kasambala has 20 years of experience working in East and Southern Africa on human rights, democracy, and governance. Before joining Freedom House, Tiseke was a Deputy Executive Director and Head of Programs at the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, OSISA, where she provides strategic leadership and oversaw the implementation of a multi-million-dollar grants program. Prior to that, she worked at Human Rights Watch in various leadership positions, including as Southern African Director and Africa Advocacy Director. Tiseke is a published author, and her opinion pieces have appeared in numerous local, regional, and international news outlets. She holds a master's degree in social science from the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Thank you, Tiseke, for making time for us and for being our guest speaker today. Thank you very much and welcome. So I think I'll just kick right off and ask you in terms of, you've had this 20 years of experience, but let's start at the beginning. Where did this dedication to human rights and democracy start from?
Thank you very much, Teranya. And let me first begin by thanking you and Future Africa for inviting me to participate in this forum. It's very exciting to see people taking time out from their weekends to actually come and discuss issues of democracy that are so relevant for the African continent. Where to begin? Where did I start my journey in terms of being a human rights activist and supporter and pushing for the advancement of democracy? I was born in the 1970s in Malawi, and this was an interesting period of time. We were under the autocratic rule of President Kamuzu Banda, who ruled Malawi for 30 years from 1964 to 1994. So this was a very interesting period of time. Banda was initially seen, and we initially saw him as a liberator. He liberated us from colonial rule. But as time went by, he became increasingly authoritarian. He banned other political parties. It was a one-party state. It was a highly repressive environment where the rights to freedom of expression, the rights to freedom of association were essentially curtailed. And it was a highly paternalistic society. In many ways, President Banda saw us as his children. He ruled by decree. What he said was what went. So growing up in such a highly repressive environment really made me see, just how important democracy and human rights were for the development of a country such as Malawi. As I said, his rule ended in 1994, and Malawi has essentially been a multi-party democracy since then. But the effects of his rule are still felt to this day in Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries on the continent. Wonderful, beautiful country, but one of the poorest. And that's the damage that I think authoritarian rule actually brings to societies. And I was a victim of that kind of society throughout my youth and all the way until I was 18 years old.
Thank you for that. Thank you for bringing that into the inspiration of what has brought you to being so deep into democracy. Before we move on with that experience and with how that influenced you, I'm wondering how has that shaped your understanding of what democracy means? Let's understand what Tiseke understands as democracy.
Well, I think I've alluded to it a little bit, but what does democracy mean for me? The first one is, the respect for fundamental human rights. Malawians, under Dr. Banda's rule, their rights were trampled upon. We didn't have the right to speak out. If you criticized his government, you either had to flee into exile, you were arrested, or you disappeared and you were never seen again. It means freedom of association, as I've said, being able to pick the political party that you want to support. issues around freedom of expression, having your own opinion. For example, when I was growing up, and when I joined the University of Malawi, political science had been banned as a subject. That's what shapes you. So I couldn't even study political science. I didn't know what political science actually meant. The separation of powers and independence of the judiciary under autocratic rule, we did not see all those things. Those are all fundamental to democracy. And those are what shape democratic thinking and democracy.
And so let's jump a bit to present day, just get a grasp of how you've gone to that. You've talked about democracy and what it means to you. And how does that then look like in terms of your work as Director of Africa Programs at Freedom House right now at the moment?
So the organization that I work for, Freedom House, advances democracy and fundamental freedoms across the world. We have a flagship report called Freedom in the World, which essentially assesses and measures civil liberties and political rights across the globe in around 195 countries and 15 territories around the world. So my job as the Africa Director is essentially to, advance freedoms and democracy on our continent, in Africa. And it's been a very interesting time doing this job. I've been Africa Director for 1 year, but I joined Freedom House as Southern Africa Chief of Party 3 years before that. And as you know, as you've said, I've been working on the continent around issues related to freedoms, human rights, democracy more broadly for many, many years now. The work I do at Freedom House really gives us a snapshot and gives me a snapshot of what's going on around the world and gives me a snapshot of the trajectory of democracy on our continent, since the first waves of democracy, since the end of colonial rule, all the way into the third wave, where there was so much optimism when multi-party democracy was introduced. A lot of countries embraced it in the 1990s. And doing my work at Freedom House, we see this trajectory. We see the ups and the peaks, and then we see sometimes sadly the decline and the reversals across the globe. Yeah,
it's point that you've spoken about the peaks and the declines. I was reading one of your articles in preparations for this on Africa's role in setting a global agenda for democracy. And you mentioned that in the Freedom Report that you recently released, there's about 8 African countries that have been designated as free. I was hoping you could expand about this notion of free that Freedom House works with, and how come there are only 8 countries that can be established as free on the African continent?
Thanks. So yes, as you heard, I mentioned a flagship report that Freedom House produces on an annual basis every year. And essentially this report measures civil liberties and political rights. And under civil liberties, it looks at, amongst other things, the right to freedom of expression and belief, the right to freely associate, the right to freedom of movement, as an example, personal autonomy and other individual freedoms. And then under the political rights section, it also looks at electoral processes, it looks at how governments function, and it looks at political pluralism across a country. And overall, the total scores from those two, the civil liberties and the political rights, allow us to make a designation of whether a country is free, not free, or partly free. Our 2023 report, which we released a couple of months ago, actually a month ago in March, essentially shows that on our continent, only 17 countries are actually designated as free. 17%, sorry, 17% of countries in Africa. We assess the entire sub-Saharan Africa and parts of North Africa as well. 17% are free, 37% are designated as partly free, and then 46% are designated as not being free. So of that 17%, literally right now, I think for 2023, only 9 countries in Africa have the designation of being free, which is, really, really disheartening in many ways. And you have a significant proportion of African citizens living in this range of around 37% being only partly free and 46% being not free. And if you look at the percentage of the population, it means 50% of Africans are currently living in countries that are designated by our report as not being free.
And so on that, I'm wondering, we're used to discussing the negative or highlighting negatives about Africa, shifting this a bit more into a narrative of proactivism. And with the work you've done, what is it that Africans can do to begin to see more countries establish themselves as free?
I think Africans across the continent, particularly young people, are already doing a lot. And I think that's what really gives me optimism about the trajectory of our continent in the next 10 to 20 years. We all talk about the youth dividend. We all talk about, how Africa has a large young population. What we should be talking more about is what young people are doing to essentially push the envelope when it comes to democratic freedoms in Africa. And a big one, in my opinion, is political participation. Young people participating not just in elections, because elections are just one element, electoral processes are just one element of a functioning democracy, but in other ways, participating at local, municipal, regional, sub-regional, and national level in the functioning of government, participating in consultations related to the things that matter most, whether it's social service delivery, the delivery of healthcare, water, education, pushing back when the civic space or the space for civic activism starts to close. Young people are at the forefront of pushing back. And we've seen this in so many movements. I think in Nigeria, we had the End SARS campaign, which was fundamentally pushed forward by young people. In Sudan, the pro-democracy movement that led to the, the fall of Omar al-Bashir in 2019, although unfortunately things have deteriorated again, but that democracy movement was led by young people. In South Africa, where I am based, we saw the fees must fall movement by young people demanding, better education and an elimination of very extortionist fees in terms of when it came to tertiary education and asking for subsidies. And so when you look across the globe, this involvement of young people on various platforms, on various issues that pertain to democracy is what can push a country from being partly free into being free. Another big part of the push for democracy relates to institutions. In countries where we have strong institutions, an independent judiciary, vibrant civil society, an independent and vibrant media who hold the government accountable, who provide the checks that are necessary for democracy to flourish. Where we see that happening, where we see these strong institutions, we see that democracy is maintained and countries remain in that free zone. South Africa, for example, despite all its huge problems, and is facing a number of serious problems currently on the economic, political, and social front, is one of those countries that is designated as free in the Freedom in the World report. Why is that? It's because South Africa has extremely strong institutions. So even in the face of corruption, in the face of attempts by leaders to kind of narrow the space, we see the media, civil society, and the judiciary all playing a fundamental role in keeping the brakes and keeping the democratic guardrails up to ensure that democracy continues to flourish in a country such as South Africa. So those are the types of things that we need to continue to see: strong institutions, strong citizen engagement in terms of ensuring that a country remains free in terms of the democratic space.
Thank you for that. I'm going to tackle a bit more of the strong citizen engagement. In your experience, spoke about at 18, after the experience Dr. Banda, and from there you've had 20 years of experience doing democracy and human rights. How did young people find these doors to work with institutions? How did you find these doors to be able to work with all these institutions and make this type of impact?
So I think that it depends. It depends on how close the society is. In a very closed society, the methods of engagement, if you're a young person, are very, very limited. And in those spaces, young people become creative. What we have seen, and I'll give the example today, currently, is how young people are innovative in terms of the use of technology. So where the space has closed, young people are increasingly turning to TikTok, to Twitter, and finding other ways of politically expressing themselves and pushing for change. In countries which are relatively free and open, I think the options are quite, varied. So, as I said, citizen engagement includes exercising your right to vote where required, participating in meetings that relate to the distribution and provision of basic social services, engaging in consultations, but also leading in your own small spaces. It doesn't have to be leading at a national level. At local levels, for example, when we see potholes on our roads, who is demanding that the local municipality do something about it? It should be young people, it should be citizens. Whether you are petitioning the mayor or the local government, that is one way of participating as in the civic space and pushing for your civil liberties. So there are various methods, and they depend on how a government functions and who within government you need to consult. But we should be appraising ourselves of this and making sure that we understand how government functions. A big role for civil society has been around training citizens about understanding the functions of government, how they can contribute and how they can push governments to institute changes. So when I was growing up in a more or less closed environment, what I saw when I arrived at university was that the universities were the bastions of political activism. Young people by nature are very contrarian. And so you have to tap into that contrarian nature, despite the environment, which was highly, repressive, very dangerous. Our lecturers were being arrested. As young people, we kept pushing. We still had political debates, even though political science was not there as a subject. But young people encouraged political debate on campus to say, what's going on in our country and how do we push back? How do we address this? So we created our own little spaces for political debate, political discourse and discussions around democracy, which really, kind of honed our thinking. Books were banned, certain types of books were banned, like Animal Farm, for example, was not found. But people were still able to find ways of engaging in the details of Animal Farm. Those who had read it, who knew of it, would speak to it. So those types of kind of really creative ways of pushing back and, increasing that kind of activism were really, really useful at the time. And it's part of what helped us as young people engage in the push for democracy in Malawi.
Thank you. One of the things you've spoken about is just like having these circles of conversations and working with other young people in Malawi at the beginning, at the start, right? In our Future Africa Network, there's been groups of people who feel disenfranchised and less motivated with the idea of democracy for Africa. With the recent turnout of events in the Nigerian elections, some displeasures with the recent Kenyan election, and various other events. The question that is looming in the Future Africa Network is democracy meant for Africa? And I wanted to see if you'd take a stab at that question at least and give them some insight on what you think.
Thank you. That's a very interesting, difficult question, but one that has certainly been asked for decades now. And I would couch it this way. I wouldn't say is democracy meant for Africans. I would say is democracy working for Africans? Is the democracy that we all see providing the social and economic dividends for Africans? And that is a more complicated question. What we have seen certainly is that studies show that where there is democracy and an open environment for civic engagement, development and the social and economic dividends eventually come through. Where there's long-term authoritarianism, those dividends don't come through. However, and this is the question now, when we say democracy, what do we actually mean in Africa? and how is it actually being practiced, right? Because the democracy that delivers is the perfect democracy, democracy that actually works. What we've seen in Africa are illiberal democracies from many countries, where democracy is just an exercise of ticking a box of holding elections, allowing 1 or 2 or 3 opposition parties the limited space to interact and engage, and then saying that, right, we held an election, we have a multi-party system, and therefore democracy, we're a democracy. And that is not the case. A lot of our leaders now see democracy as merely the holding of elections, but they are clinging onto power. A lot of the countries that we call democracies are not necessarily democracies at all. When you have a continent where at least 5 of the leaders have been in power for over 30 years or so, and maybe half a dozen more for over 10 years, can we say that most of these places are democratic? They're not. When you have countries which are supposedly democratic, like South Africa, like Botswana, but where nonetheless we have seen the dominance of one political party, and just mere changes in leadership, can we say that is democracy? And can we say it's representative of the people? And I think those are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves, where we have democracy in name, but not in substance. And these are the issues that give all of us a headache and nightmares, because what happens is democracy, as practiced in many parts of the continent today, has marginalized huge swaths of communities who are not being represented, not just at the ballot, but in terms of where the services go, who benefits from those services. We're seeing democracy being dominated by a political elite, a small percentage of political elite, where corruption continues to thrive and benefit those political elites to the detriment of the majority. That is not democracy, and the democracy that we want to see in Africa. The democracy we want to see is one that takes into consideration both development and human rights as being interdependent and mutually reinforcing. And that has not been the case in many of our countries.
Thank you, Tiseke, for that. One thing that's going to stick with me is both what you just said at the end, and also democracy in name, but not in substance, and making that differentiation. I'm going to invite one of our fellows from this cohort of 2023, Pemfero. I know you had a question, so I want to ask if you can ask the question now. Pemfero, are you with us? All right, it seems you might be having some technical issues. But with that said, we are opening the floor to you, the audience, to take a chance to also ask some of your questions, both in terms of democracy, but also in terms of Tiseke's career at this point in time. There you go, Pemfero.
Hi, Tiseke. I will ask you a question on, I'm also a fellow Malawian. I wanted to ask you, do you think as Malawi so far we have done anything to increase our youth participation in democracy? And what do you think about our democracy?
Thanks, Pemfero. I was struggling to hear you a little bit, but I think your question was, do you think Malawi has done enough to increase youth participation in democracy? And what else? I didn't get the last part of the question.
No, my last question was that, what do you think about the current state of democracy in Malawi?
All right, thank you. Let's start with the current state of democracy in Malawi. I haven't lived, so this is a caveat. I haven't lived in Malawi for over 22 years now, although I do have family and I go back and forth and I visit. So I am by no means the expert on Malawi and Malawi's democratic trajectory currently. But from what we've seen as part of the work of Freedom House, the current state of democracy in Malawi it's a mixed bag, because we have concerns about recent developments in terms of Malawi's leadership, recent issues around corruption and corruption scandals, and the failure of the Malawi government, the Malawi authorities to address these fundamental issues of governance. There was a lot of hope when the 2021 elections took place, when the previous election results were overturned by the courts, and new elections took place, which gave us hope that Malawians were demanding more, and that the judiciary remained independent, and that there was a certain type of democratic transformation taking place across the country. At the same time, however, what we continue to see in Malawi, and this is related to youth engagement, is the continual repetition. It's almost rinse and repeat, where we're seeing the same politicians, over and over again, governing the country. So over the past 30 years, since the end of one party rule in Malawi, we have seen the same politicians wearing different hats in new formations, but essentially the same people. There has been no democratic renewal when it comes to leadership in Malawi. And that has prevented the youth from effectively participating. And I would say that, all the signs are there that Malawi's young people want to participate. We saw the Human Rights Defenders Coalition, which essentially had a lot of relatively young people running that organization and pushing for that election rerun that we saw in 2021. But more needs to be done. A lot of them ended up being co-opted by the current government and becoming a part of the state, and sometimes the very problems that they were actually, marching against previously. And we can get into that. Those are also the dangers of young people and how you participate in politics, because sometimes you can also get co-opted and drawn in and become a part of the very system that you are fighting against. So yes, Malawi's record, I think, is pretty mixed at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll take Perez Mwene.
Yes, thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, so my name is Perez and I'm from Uganda. Uganda, that is East Africa. Now, I have a background in science. Me, I'm a scientist largely. I don't want to pretend to understand most of these concepts, but at least I understand something to do with civil liberty, political rights, at least in the plain language. But what I want to ask specifically for me is, how does democracy, in a sense of having political leadership, how does democracy relate with economic development? Like, I want you to draw for me a direct link, because most times, for example, in Uganda, my generation has seen only one president. Since 1986, we've had our president. And now I want to imagine that most times we look at countries and we wish for change of leadership and etc. Even in normal society. Should I say that actually most of these economic development constraints that we face are so caused by having one leader in place forever? I just want to know that direct link between democracy and economic development. Thank you.
Thanks, Perez. That's a great question. And, I think a lot of the times when we talk about these concepts, we have to be quite nuanced and unpack what it actually means. I think when you look at causation and causality, what has created something to happen, one can arguably say that there are links between economic development and democracy. But also, yes, one cannot argue against the fact that there is sometimes economic development that takes place under highly authoritarian rule or even under a dictatorship. But what a lot of studies show is that under dictatorships, economic development does not, flourish as much, but also where it has flourished and where you do see advances, it is not as long lasting as people expect it to be. As I said, also, it is not mutually exclusive, right? These concepts depend on each other. Where there is development, you also sometimes see people having the luxury and freedoms to then focus on democratic growth. Where there's democracy, it allows for the greater participation of people in economic development. At the same time, when we talk about economic development, we should also be asking ourselves, economic development for who and to whose benefit? And oftentimes, what we see in these very autocratic countries, people will be brought up only to a certain level, and then nothing else happens beyond them. The rest of the world is cooled and held by a small political elite. Whether you're looking at China, which is always used as a great example of economic development. Yes, China has come a long way when you look at the economic indicators and developmental indicators. It has brought its people out of the poverty into the middle class. One cannot argue against that. But as we continue to progress, you have to ask yourself, is the current model that China is using now really continuing to benefit the majority of its people? The studies show otherwise. You can argue about Saudi Arabia and oil wealth, but what good is all that oil wealth when, as a woman, you're not allowed to drive, when you're oppressed, when you're imprisoned for speaking out, when you are under threat of being beheaded or essentially killed for criticizing the Saudi regime? Those are all the questions we have to ask ourselves, right? What good is economic wealth when you can't make a suggestion to the political elite who are running that country and say, well, why don't we use our wealth in this way or that way? To say that means you could be imprisoned, you could be sent into exile, you could be disappeared, you could be killed. So I would argue that a lot of the human rights defenders in these countries that are often kind of touted as, you know, models of development without democracy, a lot of those who have borne the brunt of these autocrats will tell you that that development, that type of development is never worth it, and it does not withstand the test of time, unlike in countries which are democratic. So that would be my answer. It's not a straight answer. It's much more complex than that. But I would also urge you, Perez, to read up. There's a lot of studies by UNDP and others that look at the correlation between development and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiseke. We then have Didas.
Thank you, Tiseke, for sharing the experience working on democracy in Africa. My name is Didas. I'm from Rwanda. You talked about illiberal democracies in Africa, and I was wondering your opinion on the fact that sometimes the international community seems to be imposing this notion of illiberal democracy. I can give examples. In 2014, we saw countries like France trying to support Blaise Compaoré, although it was violating the constitution. In Central Africa in 2019, I think the UN used the phrase election at all costs, despite massive claims that the elections won't be inclusive of all parties. So we see all these cases where the international community is actually forcing the hand and trying to maintain the status quo of liberal democracy. So I'm wondering, as Freedom House, as an international NGO, what sort of political advocacy do you conduct to make sure that the democratization process in Africa is not hindered by foreign motives or like foreign priorities? Thank you.
Thank you, my brother from Rwanda. Again, a very important question. And one of the things we should kind of again unpack is, you know, the concept of democracy and it being a Western construct. You know, the concept of democracy, we the people, for the people, by the people, is something that I would argue is held up by people across the globe. That concept that things that must be done by us, for us, with us, right? And if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is 75 years to today, it wasn't just Western governments that came up with that concept and had that discussion. It involved governments from across the globe. That's the first thing. The second thing is, yes, certainly, I, for one, am highly critical of the hypocrisy that sometimes creeps out from, governments in the global north, Western governments, who themselves often grapple with democracy and democratic practice. There's no greater example than the United States itself, which is supposed to be the bastion of democracy, which has faced democratic challenges and does not always make sure that democracy delivers for its entire population for decades now. So democracy is not perfect and hasn't been perfect in Western governments and in Western countries or the global north as well. The issue of interference is an interesting one, because certainly Africa has been the victim of Western interference for hundreds of years. So that's why we talk about waves of democracy, from slavery to colonial rule, to the 1990s, where we had IMF conditionalities that in terms of if you're going to get a loan from the IMF, you had to put in place certain conditions, you had to respect human rights, you had to do all these various governance checks, to meet the standards of the IMF, where they were pushing for structural adjustment programs that were not always successful. And those were all in some way or the other problematic, whilst also in some ways required, right? And I think we should be very careful as Africans not to conflate the issue of Western interference in our sovereignty and certain hypocritical tendencies and notions with what we want ourselves as Africans in terms of democracy and the demands that we should be placing on our own leaders in terms of democracy. Oftentimes we find it too easy, and our own leaders find it easy to point towards Western interference, the Western introduction of culture, as excuses for not delivering themselves on democracy, as pretexts for being abusive and being repressive of their citizens. So whilst we can criticize certain aspects of certain Western interventions in our politics, we should be very careful not to conflate that with directly addressing some of our own problems, the problems that we face as African countries when it comes to democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiseke. I'll call upon Anne.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Anne from Nigeria. I have a question. Considering the outcome of the 2023 presidential election in Nigeria, where the people's choice might have been said to be denied, this has led some youth losing interest in politics because it's being believed that the dominant party control every sector, including the judicial system. How can the youth be encouraged to have resilience and keep engaging in the political process?
Thank you very much. And I think that's a very important question. A lot of times we've seen elections that have been rigged or stolen and that have not represented the will of the people. And in that particular case, it's understandable that a lot of people become discouraged and disaffected and do not vote when it comes to elections. I would say there's two things. And the Nigerian elections, I think, still need to be kind of really unpacked in terms of what that election result meant, in terms of, in fact, voter turnout itself. I think it's interesting to see, what's the percentage of Nigerians that actually turned out. From the statistics that I've seen, it was already a low turnout in the first place, which makes me wonder why that initial enthusiasm that we saw for the new political party and the new leader that a lot of Nigerians thought would kind of change the political dynamics of Nigeria, why they didn't come out to vote on that day, and whether it was down to electoral malpractice on the part of the main electoral body, or it was also down to people really not turning out to vote. Electoral malpractice, inefficiencies, ineffectiveness, or people just not turning out to vote. I think that's not been made quite clear, which makes Nigeria a bit more of a complex situation in terms of answering what exactly happened. But there are many occasions where elections are rigged, and that makes people unwilling to vote. But there's other ways of showing your displeasure, and there's other ways of pushing. As I've said, I think Malawi is a great example, where when that election was fundamentally flawed, Malawians came out into the streets to say that they had a problem with the electoral management body at the time and the electoral chairperson at the time. They said she did not run an efficient and effective electoral process, and they pushed back and demanded that there should be a rerun of the vote. They came out in large numbers and they never gave up. You know, that election took place in I think it was 2020, and it took a whole year of Malawians coming out into the streets and protesting to push the government and the judiciary to actually reassess the results of those elections and then call for a new election. So there's a lot of methods. The political parties themselves had petitions before the courts, but people in the streets came out and said, enough of this. And so I would urge people not to be apathetic in terms of exercising their right to vote. And where their vote has been stolen, where they can, they should come out into the streets, they should protest peacefully. The right to peacefully assemble is a big one. Find ways of pushing for change. We can't give up because, you know, that's what our governments want us to do. They want us to give up. They want us to not be active. They want a complacent citizenry, one that is docile, one that does not push back. And the aim is for us not to be docile, to be activists in nature and to push back where things have gone wrong.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat that was dropped by at least Loretta Robinson. She says, I was moved by the NSAS movement as an African American. What are some tangible steps that African Americans and Africans can take together in order to uplift others' efforts toward human rights and democracy that represents our interests?
Tangible steps in terms of uplifting human rights. I think when you talked about NSAS, I think that's great. And I think, again, it goes back to young people and young people's engagement. We talk about civic education a lot of times, but we talk about it in the, you know, in the global South space. But even in the US, what I've seen, the US has traditionally very low voter turnouts. A lot of young people don't understand how the states function, how the federal government functions. And so civic education is a tangible step in terms of pushing for it, both throughout schools, through the education system, but outside of the educational system as well. I think that's a tangible step in terms of understanding what your civic rights are, what your civic duties and responsibilities are, and how you can act them out. Same thing when it comes to education. I've seen that in the states, in the US, certain states have been pushing back and tried to censor reading and books, certain books in schools. That is a big sign because they don't want people to be well read. They don't want people to understand human rights from their perspective. They don't want people to understand the history of their country. A lot of governments censor. Since government censorship is designed because it stops people from thinking and questioning and understanding their histories. So a tangible step in terms of understanding human rights is making sure that we're able to, the reading is out there, the information is out there, both in terms of books and reading, but also in terms of kind of sensitizing people, awareness campaigns at grassroots level, at rural level, even for those who can't read, making people understand exactly what civil liberties actually mean, what fundamental freedoms, the right to free expression, association, and organization actually mean.
Thank you, Tiseke. We'll then take Godson.
All right. Thank you so much, Taraga. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you so much to our facilitator, been following all that you've been saying all along, and it's been so interesting. And so my question, I'm going to ask a question from the one disadvantage I've seen about democracy, and of course how it has affected African countries, and that would be that democracy thrives on informed citizenships. Like when citizens are informed, that's when democracy thrives. But then in African countries where so many citizens are not informed, there is high illiteracy. People don't even know what is good for them. They can be induced to make choices that is even against their will, right? Do you think, number one, that African countries are ripe for democracy, following the fact that we have a lot of people? Let me use my country, Nigeria, as an example, where we have so many people who don't even, who are not educated, or apart from even being educated, who are poor. And to an extent, poverty has controlled or influenced how they make decisions during elections. And secondly, if it's good for Africa as a continent, like if democracy is good, then how do we educate this population? What strategies do you think that we can adopt to ensure that we reach the wider population of Africans living in interior places or interior part of Africa about democracy? Thank you.
Thanks, Godson. Is a country ever ripe for democracy? I think that's an interesting, also an interesting one. I don't think there are any conditions that lead to, a country being actually ready for democracy. I think every country is ready for democracy because it has a population that should have the right, as I said, to participate, to drive, and be a part of the wider political agenda and the wider political discourse. So that there's that part. And I think, arguably, that African citizens, whether they're in the rural areas, whether they're educated or not, recognize democracy. When we talk about, if you look at historically, we lived in spaces that to one extent or another were democratic. Yes, the chief was often the final decision maker, but the chief also had a council. So in various forms, successfully and not so successfully, Africans have been practicing a form of democracy where people want to be, you go to the chief, you go and petition to be heard, and you are heard, and then the chief makes a decision. Chiefs could not just make decisions without consultation, which is essentially democracy in some way or another. So I think there's that often we assume that people do not understand democracy and what it means. But I think the more important thing that you raise, Godson, is around how governments and political parties have used people's status and the poverty that we see persist on our continent to their advantage, whether it's by buying people's votes through food packages, through supplies, giving people bicycles and stuff like that, and essentially buying the vote. And I think that is a bigger problem that needs to be addressed. Who should be addressing this? We already see that civil society organizations oftentimes play a big role in engaging in this, in sensitizing communities, making people aware, raising awareness, as you've said, across the board about knowing your rights, what are your rights, and also understanding that being bought, in terms of your vote being bought, does not essentially translate to you benefiting when that particular party comes into power. Telling people that they should be able to question those that come to them about what exactly they intend to do in terms of policies and plans that will benefit the population. And many of you, I don't know if you read the Afrobarometer surveys that are quite excellent kind of surveys that measure how Africans view what's happening in their country from a democratic perspective, human rights perspective. Those surveys sometimes go into rural areas as well. And each time they talk about how Africans believe in democracy, prefer democracy to other forms, but just don't believe it's delivering for them. So I think the biggest challenge for all of us in these spaces, those of you who are listening here, is how we ensure that we are pushing our leaders to bring about democracies that actually deliver. And where those leaders fail to do so, we are holding them accountable and removing them through democratic means from power. And bringing that system to play, I think is a very important one. I saw Teranya put the link for Afrobarometer. If you have not seen those surveys, please go through them. They're very illuminating. They'll give you a great snapshot about what's going on in the continent and how people view their leaders and their governments. But I don't know if I've answered the question, because I think it's a very complicated one. But what is needed from us and from civil society and citizens who are engaged is to ensure that we're pushing back the envelope, we're pushing it to sensitize our own communities where we live, but also pushing back against the government and ensuring that governments are actually operating in a way that that delivers. Thank you, Teranya.
Sorry, apologies for interrupting you there.
Yeah,
thank you. I was going to ask if the tender could, if they're able to ask the question, they drop a question. It's one of those challenges that people are still contending with. Tatenda, are you able to ask your question? I don't know if the mic is turning on. Already not turning on the mic. Tatenda's asked, I want to know if there's a proper transition from one-party system to multi-party in Africa, because I think people see democracy as a tool of malgovernance, and how we as Africans can deal with neo-colonialism.
Great question. No, I think I would argue, yes, that there has been a failure of transitioning from the one-party system to the multi-party system for various reasons. Amongst them is a lot of our political elite now see democracy as a zero-sum game, elections as a zero-sum game. So if you win, you gain everything, and if you're the loser, you gain nothing. As I've also said, democracy is not delivering because it's centered around a small percentage of political elite who have not delivered it for the majority, which has made that transition from one-party rule to multi-partyism a very difficult one. Malgovernance, indeed, those in power have decided that they'll feed at the trough and that they will feed themselves and benefit themselves, their cronies, and their extended families to the detriment of the people. And they are in a relationship with big multinational companies and corporations and leaders whose interests are not necessarily with Africa. So we are seeing this conflation of a corrupt political leadership, corrupt political elites, extractive companies that are coming to Africa to extract our resources. So there's a private sector that is a highly extractive international private sector. We've seen this coming both from Western governments, China, and increasingly now even some Middle Eastern powers are interested in Africa's resources. This conflation of all these actors, this bringing together of all these actors has led to growing inequalities, increasing poverty, greater marginalization, and as you said, a system that is not delivering for the people. And it is up to us again, once again, to probe, to question, to flag, to highlight, to whistleblow where we see these types of developments. Examples of where this has happened, the DRC, which continues to see war because of its mineral resources and its wealth, which continues to see private actors coming in, flooding in, other governments flooding in to extract these resources, and various actors from the Congo itself, domestic actors, fighting for those resources to the detriment of the population of the Congo and the Congolese people. We have to fight back against it. No one is saying that Western governments are are coming with all Western governments are coming with good intentions to our continent. That is not the case. They also have their own political and economic interests that they are pursuing. And again, that's why I always bring it back to our own leadership. If you have African leadership that has integrity, that is honest, that has the interests of people at heart, then there is opportunity to push back against the involvement of certain nefarious actors in how Africa's resources are distributed and used.
Thank you, Tiseke. Thank you. We have two questions in the chat. The first one is from Shadrach Angani. They say, it's debatable whether democracy is the best system of governance. And on our WhatsApp platform, he's a fellow in the WhatsApp group. There's a fellow WhatsApp group, they have discussions they do. We argued extensively whether it is the best for Africa and how it could be improved. But democracy, like any other system, has its challenges. And Kechi from Nigeria asked a question along one of the challenges. This is Anne, which is voter apathy in my study about democracy. Sorry, which is voter apathy. In my study about democracy, I read that populism is a problem to democracy in the sense that it can be divisive, creating an us versus them mentality and fueling hostility towards minorities and other marginalized groups. My question is, do you believe populism is a challenge to democracy? And if it is, how can that be addressed?
Thank you very much, Teranya. And just to warn you that one of the flaws of democracy, we're going to get load shedding here in South Africa soon. So I'm trying to switch my phone so that we don't get cut off. So just 1 second, so that when the electricity goes off, I can remain connected. Yes, I think very, very, very important question in terms of yes, very right, agree. Democracy is not perfect. We've seen it being practiced imperfectly throughout the world, and I don't think we can ever achieve a perfect democracy. But populism, which is not democracy, but in many ways a tool that is used by leaders to whip up sentiments, to whip up whether it's anti-immigrant sentiments against one religion or the other, against ethnicity, as a way of winning the popular vote. That is used and exercised. Populism is a tool. And it's a tool that, yes, indeed, has to be challenged because it thrives on our worst natures. You know, the nature which tells us to look at others as being foreign to us, not being a part of us. And we've seen this rising populism that has led to global declines in democracy across the world in places such as Turkey, in places such as Poland, in Hungary, in Europe, in America under former President Donald Trump, and of course on parts of this continent. So there needs to be a pushback against populism. There needs to be a challenge against the misinformation that populism often thrives upon, which leads to discrimination, which leads to the othering of people, which leads to marginalization. The onus is on us as citizens to challenge that type of information within our communities where we live at all levels, to challenge those who thrive on kind of hatred. And my argument is populism is the worst form, and I would argue it was democracy exercised, but it's a tool that is used by those who've been voted into power to continue to entrench themselves in power by essentially appealing to the worst aspects of human nature.
Thank you, Tiseke. And then Ezra Mugambi, another one of our fellows from Kenya, asks, my question, what is your take on externally influenced democracy? Some institutions, multinational companies, and foreign governments are internally a hindrance to democracy in Africa, while on the face value, they preach the involvement in promoting democracy in these countries. Sometimes this happens through covert political manipulation, sanctions, and sometimes military intervention like it happened in Libya and Egypt some years back. What is your take? does it really promote democracy?
My take on externally transplanted democracy is that it's a democracy that doesn't last. Democracy must come from within countries, from within, amongst people. And yes, these misadventures we have seen on the part of the Americans, for example, in Iraq, have only worsened the situation. They left a political vacuum, and what we've seen in Iraq now, has been almost decades and years of political strife in that country. So you cannot transplant democracy. But at the same time, those who are democratic do have a responsibility to spread and speak of democratic values. You cannot say that because we're democratic, we don't have a responsibility to actually speak of the values of democracy, in other parts of the world. And so those who have the ability to influence certainly have a responsibility to promote and push for democratic values. Because as we've argued, and this has been the debate we've been having all along, is democracy something that Africans want? Is democracy necessary? And I guess that is the argument. If you think that democracy is something we want and that it is necessary, then there is nothing wrong with engaging with other democratic allies and talking about and promoting democratic values. If you don't think that democracy is right, then you're having a totally different debate, because you will see those who speak about democracy as being, intruders and intrusive and interfering in the day-to-day runnings of government. So again, I think a lot of times we conflate so many different issues. On the one hand, yes, there's Western interference in the political runnings of other countries that has led to horrendous violations and has not improved the situation. But that has not been done in the interest of spreading democracy. That is just a facade. That has been done in the interest, in terms of political and economic interests. Like, as I said, we saw in Iraq. So former President George Bush used the spread of democracy, in my opinion, as a cover to cover up in America's own political and economic interests that it had in Iraq. So that, to me, was not actually spreading democracy at all. So we always need to kind of separate all these issues. And just because a country there's Western interference in a country, or let's say we've seen in places like Zimbabwe, which likes to argue about sanctions. Zimbabwe has travel sanctions for those who've committed horrendous abuses in their country. When Western governments and other democratic allies do that, they're doing that as to signal that they do not support autocratic rule, authoritarianism, the repression of citizens. Why would we have a problem with that? With sanctions that actually target leaders? When the ICC decided to indict President Omar Bashir for widespread human rights violations in Sudan, it was a correct decision to make because he had committed widespread violations. That was not interference in the sovereignty of Sudan. So we really have to separate all these various issues, where we must ensure that people are being held accountable, that there is no impunity for human rights violations against one's own citizens, and at the same time that we're ensuring that democracy is homegrown, nurtured by the citizens of that country to design a democracy that they want to see. So yes, I agree with you about certain types of interference, and that is wrong. But also, I also want to say to you that if you really want democracy, there's nothing wrong with pushing for it and holding those that use it, do not use it, and oppress their citizens to account when allowed to do so, whether it's through multilateral platforms such as the UN and the ICC, or whether it's through bilateral engagement between one country to another, where you're pushing to say, look, you are killing your own people and that is wrong, and we do not subscribe to that, and therefore we will not work with you. I do not say anything wrong with countries that do that.
Thank you, Tiseke. One more in the chat from Godson. He's asking, what advice do you have for young people working to strengthen democracy in countries where a minority elites class has organized the wealth of the society and concentrated political power within their tiny circle, using the institutions of state to silence voices calling for change and demanding accountability?
Hi, Teranya, could you repeat that? Sorry.
Did I break up a little bit?
Yes, sorry.
All right, I'll repeat again, sorry. What advice do you have for young people working to strengthen democracy in countries where a minority elite class has organized the wealth of the society and concentrated political power within their tiny circle, using institutions of state to silence voices calling for change and demanding accountability?
Great. I think this has been an ongoing, again, we've been talking about this throughout this particular discussion about
Apologies for that. It seems we have lost Tiseke. Technical issues, but please do be patient with us as she rejoins shortly. In the meantime, please do feel free to add your questions to the chat or start a discussion or engage with each other. Tiseke, welcome back.
yes, the lights have gone off.
No worries. We understand.
Yes, but I'm back. What I was saying, sorry, Teranya, was that, you know, young people need to continue to use the various institutions and tools that are at their disposal at all levels of government to continue participating in their civic duties as citizens. And at the same time, they also have a responsibility in spreading, you know, democracy in their communities at all levels. So my response to you is that it's only through your own organizing as young people, your own activism and participation in the day-to-day functioning of government and other institutions that you can start to institute those changes. There's various ways you can do it. Young people can form their own political parties. Young people should be petitioning their governments and their authorities when things go wrong. Demanding service delivery, demanding the equitable distribution of the resources that our countries have. It's only by doing so, it's hard work, but a lot of the developments that we've seen today came from that kind of activism, whether it is the end of apartheid, whether it is how the civil rights movement came to be, in pushing back against, pushing for civil and political rights for African Americans in the US. It was all done through citizen engagement, civic activism, peaceful protests. Those are the types of ways that you can use as young people to dismantle these current political systems that only benefit a small percentage of the country, of our countries, sorry.
Thank you, Tiseke. We do have some questions in the chat, but I want to call on Samantha Katsande, one of our fellows, to ask a question. Samantha, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, Tiseke, you mentioned that in your time they banned political science at the university level, and you also mentioned something about government censorship. But then we are trying to talk about civic engagement and civic participation, trying to educate the citizens about politics and behind politics and democracy. How then do we get access to these people when the government has control over the curriculum in high schools, curriculum in universities, and they try by all means to censor what's going out there or what's coming out from the youth to the social media platforms? For example, I know in Zimbabwe, especially during elections or when it's not really stable, they switch off the internet. That means information is being censored. It won't reach the people who really need it at that particular moment. And then there are also times whereby it's expensive for people to access the internet. That means those who cannot really get the information, those from the rural areas, the youth who are many or who can push forward democracy, how then do we go around the barriers that are being put by the government and those in leadership to ensure that we educate the public, especially when it comes to the youth and those who cannot access public social media platforms to gain more knowledge about democracy and anything surrounding that? How do we go around these barriers and empower the citizens to make the decisions and also push forward for their rights and their voices to be respected? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, a very important question. Look, I don't think there's an easy answer. And I think that's why I also made kind of the distinction between operating in a closed environment where there's absolutely no information that's allowed to get out there, where government has control over all your access to information. Semi-closed societies or societies where sometimes, like for example, around elections, things close down and then, the environment opens up after the elections. And then free societies where people have access to information, access and the ability to engage in political processes. Those are very different and very distinct. So the example you give where there's widespread censorship and no access to that information is one where opening up that space is going to be challenging. And there must be a multiple kind of pronged approach to trying to get that information to citizens. And that's where the various institutions come to play, whether it's civil society, the media, outside partners who can work in solidarity with the country to put pressure on the leadership to open up and to change. It's that kind of society, it's very, very difficult to achieve change. And what I must say is that it's always heartening though to see, even in places where the environment is relatively closed, brave human rights activists and citizens who are working to engage communities, to sensitize communities, even in those types of closed off spaces. One of the beauties of the current times we live in is technology, which has led to greater innovation compared to when I was a student in Malawi back in the early 1990s and late 80s and early 1990s. Technology gives us the path that, and you're right, yes, data is high, but what I've seen is that, young people in particular are able to circumvent, all these attempts at censorship using technology to spread the word, to mobilize each other, to bring each other together, to advocate. And it's in those spaces which sometimes governments can't get to that the greatest kind of changes begin, where the seed is planted and starts to flourish. So yes, it's tough, but we must not be disheartened. What we need to do, and it's platforms such as these, is to start sharing ideas about how to innovate, how to be creative in approach when it comes to advancing democracy and human rights in some countries which are extremely closed off. It's this type of engagement, this kind of discussions, sharing of ideas and knowledge that I think is beneficial and can benefit our societies. And I would like to encourage Future Africa, for example, these types of monthly platforms that you hold, bring in others from outside the continent, from the global south, from other parts of the global south, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in parts of Asia. How are they mobilizing? What do they think of the future of their continents, and how are they coming together to discuss innovative approaches that push for democracy and freedoms? We need to start learning more from each other and collaborating and working in solidarity.
Thank you. I saw Julius unmuted himself. I'm not sure if he has a question. They may have just dropped off. Nadiri Khalidi has, one of our fellows has a question that I think has been quite a conversation and debate that we've had for today. How can democratic institutions and processes be adapted and improved to better serve the needs and interests of diverse African populations? And how can citizens be empowered to hold these institutions accountable for their actions?
I like that. I think as a starting point, before we even talk about adapting institutions, we need to have those core institutions that allow for democracy in place in the first place. And I think at the beginning of this discussion, I talked about, what are the conditions that allow for democracy to flourish, whether it's the various institutions, independent electoral bodies, an independent judiciary, media, the various aspects that lead to democracy should be in place first. And then only then should we talk about how do we adapt them to meet the changing contexts and all the contexts within which, a lot of African citizens are operating in. And there are so many things that can be done, making sure, for example, that the courts and people are able to access justice systems across the board, that their needs are being met by introducing different types of political systems and institutions in rural areas where someone does not have to go to a town to be able to make a complaint about, a lack of water or a lack of a water source. So developing those institutions on the ground in various communities, in grassroots communities, the very institutions that we see at national level, bringing them to the people, and then, as we said, adapting with the engagement of citizens themselves. So adapting is not just about adapting, right? Adapting is about listening to citizens and saying, what is it that you think would benefit you, and how must we approach these systems in a manner that benefits you and works for you? That is what we would like to see across the board, but it requires an investment from our leaders. And that's why we continue to demand the right type of leadership that allows for these types of processes to actually take place.
Thank you, Tiseke. Just to save time, we're going to take these next two questions together. Rachel, we'll have Rachel go, then Manal. So Rachel, go ahead and ask your question.
So my question is related from what you've just spoken about the institutions. And I think one of the key things to ensuring that we achieve the near perfect democracy or the perfect democracy would be strengthening our institutions. So maybe in your work or with your years of experience, what are some of the ways that you've seen that we can be able to strengthen our institutions to ensure that they are independent and impartial, such that even if they are based at the local level and all that, we can trust them as the citizens, and but they're independent. I think that's my question. Thank you. Besides capacity building of the institutions, so what else maybe can be done? Thank you.
And then we'll have Manal.
Hi, everyone. I'm very sorry for the background sound because I'm outside. Actually, I don't have a question, but more of a contribution, because earlier you have mentioned that it's very important for us to have a comparative study of the democratic practices and also the issues that are facing countries from Latin America, from Asia, and other parts of the world. And there was a study that was conducted by the platform of Debate in Africa and Debate in Europe last year, right before the Global Forum of Democracy, where they did a comparative study of the youth perception of democracy in both Europe, Africa, and Asia. And it was some of the key findings were very interesting, especially for Asian countries, where they found that democracy was not really a priority and it was not important, as long as well-being was established and the basic public needs and public services were met. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you very much. How do we strengthen institutions beyond capacity building? I think that's key. So one essential element, yes, is capacity building, working with those who work in these institutions and training them to understand how these institutions should operate. Two, there needs to be greater resourcing and investment in these institutions. We often talk about, the independence of the judiciary, but in order for a judiciary to be truly independent, it needs to be well-resourced, it needs to be well-staffed, and have the ability to actually make those rulings without the danger of co-optation. So resourcing these key institutions that we work with, electoral management bodies, for example, only have resources as the elections are looming. And there's very little investment in electoral management bodies in between elections, right? And that does not always help the effectiveness in terms of function of electoral management bodies when they're suddenly given huge resources in the 6 months before an election and not well resourced, in those cycles between, right? Another big one beyond that for me is, Manal talked about it, is institutions themselves and those who work in those institutions working with others, learning good practices from other similar institutions, looking at innovative practices of making these key institutions effective, whether it's the judiciary, electoral management bodies, other functions of government, the legislature, for example, parliamentarians. Is there enough cross-cutting learnings from others in terms of how democracy actually functions and how you can be more effective? My argument is there's not enough of that. Finally, I want to talk about cultural changes in how we see things. There needs to be a cultural change within some of these institutions. For example, the legislature for me is a big one. Parliamentarians often go into parliament as a career and not as a vocation, and not something that they see as a way of delivering for their constitutions, for their citizens and their people in their constituencies. And so changing the culture across these various institutions that sees democracy as being only of benefit to ourselves and our immediate family is key. And that is a much longer, much more difficult process. But again, I'm hopeful because I'm surrounded and I'm in a platform where there's lots of young people who are thinking differently. You can change your institutions if more of you start being a part of these institutions and changing the culture as well. Manal, I like what you said. So this is an interesting one. And again, there's never enough time, which is why there are no easy answers. I try to avoid giving very easy answers because these discussions are not easy. So it's interesting that in Asia, people say that their priority is well-being and not necessarily democracy. But I think often what we forget is this issue of what does well-being actually mean? Well-being in many ways are the social and economic rights that governments are supposed to deliver to us, right? The right to health, the right to education, the right to food, the right to basic health services, all that. And again, I argue that all that forms the broader part of human rights. I don't truly think that you can fully have one set of those rights without the other, that these rights are indivisible and that they're mutually reinforcing and that they go together. I would argue that the leadership, and also Asia is not one huge block. And so it would be interesting to see this research, and if you can put links and I can get access to these links, I'll be really interested to read about which parts of Asia see these things that way and which countries in Asia have maybe alternative views. It will be fascinating to see the breakdown because some may be under more authoritarian rule and some may be more democratic. So thank you for raising that, but it's certainly something that we will continue to debate because there's always going to be people on one side who say development and democracy don't go hand in hand, and others who say no, they do go hand in hand. I am of the view that they go hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiseke. We're right just on time. I'm going to ask the audience to give us maybe 2 minutes because I have 2 concluding questions for you. The first is, as you mentioned, there's young Africans here who from the discussion we've had, are very content with this idea of democracy, human rights, and also figuring out how their place in contributing to their communities. What advice would you have for them to build upon the work you've done and build similar careers to yours?
Always be critical. I think one of the things I've really enjoyed about being on this platform is the tough probing questions that people are not just saying, we're not just saying, okay, well, she's right, democracy delivers and their freedoms. People are asking me these tough questions. So always be critical, because no one actually has the answers. Always be willing to learn. I continue to learn. I don't think I know it all. You'll never know it all. And if you go with that thinking in mind that I'll never understand and never know it all, you always grow. Growth doesn't end. We always have the space to grow. Work hard at whatever it is that you want to achieve and in the space in which you find yourself. Be passionate, have vision about where you want to see yourself go. And always, always, always for me, think about it as this is not just about me, it is about the wider environment that I find myself in. I think if a lot of people thought about the environments they're in and those that surround them and did not think about themselves, we would have a different type of leadership than we have today, where it's based on a lot of selfishness and a very narrow view of how a society must work. So always have that broader vision in mind about how can this benefit those around me and the environment in which I find myself, and not just how can this benefit me. Selfless leadership is crucial.
Thank you very much, Tiseke. Thank you very much, our audience. Thank you, Tiseke, for pushing us in conversation and thinking about democracy, about human rights, and the African story, what it is as a responsibility. We cannot thank you enough for all the wisdom you've shared with us. I speak on behalf of many fellows here in our audience generally, we've learned a lot today. And please do let us know, maybe just now, how do you think that they can also continue to follow your work as you go forward with Freedom House and many other ventures?
Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me to this platform. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I am actually typing in my Twitter account. That's Twitter, and you can also feel free to email me and follow Freedom House also on Twitter, freedomhouse.org. Yes, so those are the platforms. Freedom House also has its own Twitter space. You just have to do a search. I think you shared our report, so our website is available for everyone. But feel free to follow me on Twitter and also send me an email on my Freedom House account. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiseke. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you all for being here today. We've really enjoyed this discussion, and I hope it pushes you to think more about democracy and your responsibility on the African continent. With that said, we've come to the end of our journey for this forum with Tiseke. We will be having another forum towards June. Stay tuned for that. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Take care.